Now that we've gone through the fundamentals of Voronoi fracturing, we will explore a very powerful tool, Boolean. The main advantage of the Boolean tools is that they will allow you to create very specific and very art-directable cuts and fractures for your destruction effects. First of all, let's take a look at the geometry that I will be using for this exercise. I have downloaded the huge Icelandic volcanic cliff from Megascans, but you can use any other similar geometry that you wish. So let's dive into the geometry node and see what I have done. So if you look at the tree, you will notice that I have loaded the file. Then I have rescaled it just a little bit so I don't have a huge model. So if you go into the information icon in a node, you will see a few very useful parameters. In this case, you can see the size of the geometry. So it has 156 meters in length, which is fine for this kind of models. So additionally, I extruded a few faces, just a tiny bit, and then I pulled them downward just so they lay flat on the ground. And I added a polyfill. So remember that usually for fracturing, and especially for Booleans, you want to make sure that you have a watertight geometry. In this case, the polyfill will ensure that all the open edges are closed. Now that my main geometry is prepared, I will generate a second geometry that will let me carve into the mountain to create some fragments. So let's create a sphere. And let's make sure it's quite large. So I will scale it to 20 meters in diameter. So I have 1 meter in radius and a uniform scale of 10. Now I will template the cliff geometry, select the sphere, and add a transform. And I will use this transform to place it just on the ledge of the rock so I can cut through it with the Boolean tool. So you can press T and then move the sphere upward. Probably in this case a bit to the right. And I will also squash it with the transform, with the scale transform. So I'll make it bigger on the x-axis, also on the y-axis, and probably I will flatten it a bit on the z-axis. Now, one very important thing when using Booleans is that both geometries have to be polygonal surfaces. So let's make sure that the sphere is, rather than a primitive, a polygon. And let's increase the frequency to 20, just to have enough detail. Now, another thing that I want to do is to add some detail to this surface. We could probably use a mountain node. And we could increase the detail size. So select the mountain node. Probably increase the element size to about 6 or 7 meters. Also increase the height to about 5 meters. And just make sure to place the sphere where it looks interesting. In this case, I want to grab the top of the cliff and probably carve into it just a little bit, not that much. But again, this is a matter of choice, and you could place the cutting geometry in a very precise place. So I think I will stick with this for now and continue to Boolean the geometry. So I will press the tab key and type BOOL to find the Boolean node. Place it just below the cliff geometry, and then connect the second input to the sphere. Now make sure to click on the Boolean visibility icon. And let's talk about the Boolean options. So first of all, very important, take a look at set A. That would be whatever geometry is coming in the first input. The default is set to treat as solid object. And this is fine for now because the cliff is a closed geometry and I want it to be treated as a solid. Same for the sphere. The sphere is a closed mesh and it should be a solid mesh. So set B, which is coming from input 2, is also being treated as a solid. Now, most importantly, we have the operation. This will determine the result of the Boolean. So by default, we have the intersection. And if you notice here on the viewport, you'll see how all the cliff has been deleted and we only have the part that was intersecting with the sphere. And this can be very useful. Let me add a null node just so we can see better this result. Let me untemplate the cliff. And here is the result of the Boolean. So by itself, this is very interesting because this can be further fractured to create, for example, an avalanche or an explosion or whatever destruction we want to create. So let's leave this as rock geometry. And I will copy the Boolean node with Ctrl+C and Ctrl+V. Make sure you have selected the Boolean too. And this time I will change the operation to subtract. So by default, it will subtract A minus B. In this case, that's fine because we want to detach the sphere from the cliff. And if you take a look at both parts, we have the positive and the negative. We have the cliff and the piece of the rock that we will crumble or we will destroy. So let's add another null. And let's call this null cliff geometry. Now we could add a normal node just to fix these black normals that we have here on the cliff. And apparently we had the same problem with the sphere. So I will also add the normal to my sphere geometry. So let me cut this with Ctrl+X and paste it with Ctrl+V just above the null. And again, copy and paste. And this will fix this strange normals that were created after the Boolean. So normally after the Boolean operation, you will have to add a normal just to fix this kind of problems that will arise. So by itself, this is looking very interesting. We have both parts of the geometry prepared to create our destruction. Now notice something very important here. The resulting geometry that was generated from the Boolean has no UVs, and this is something that you will normally want to fix. So let us go back to the sphere geometry, and before we even Boolean the cliff, let's add a UV texture node just below the sphere. So let's take a look at the sphere now. So probably for this kind of geometry, you could use either polar or I think even a planar projection could work. So let's try with orthographic. Just make sure in this case to project from the C axis. So I would change the projection axis to C. And I think this could help. So if we go back to the Boolean, I think this may work. Let's try selecting the cliff. And you will notice how the UVs from the sphere are being also inherited by this new geometry on the cliff, which is very handy. So one final advice when you're fracturing with Boolean, and I will go back to Boolean number 1 just to show you. Here below the parameters, we have a few output primitive groups. So usually I turn on B inside A, and let me show you real quick what this is doing. So I will create a blast node, click on the visibility icon for the blast, and under the group I will select this B inside A group that I just created. So notice how I'm deleting these new faces that were created inside the rock. So if I delete non-selected, you will notice how all these new faces are being grouped with this name, B inside A. And this can be very useful afterwards if maybe we want to change the texture, or probably we only want to change the UVs in this area, or even when we later want to generate debris or particles or maybe some fluids from the broken piece. So I will delete the blast node, and I will save this file so I can later use both pieces separately.